So welcome everyone today to the webinar, Safer Circles, Managing Chemicals in a Circular Economy. Today we are joined by Heather McFarlane. Heather is a project manager for FIDRA and has been working for science environmental organisations for over 15 years. Heather has held policy, communication and education roles at the Royal Society of Chemistry, the University of Edinburgh and in conservation charities around the world. Today's webinar will explore the challenges going circular poses for managing chemicals and products, and we'll look at the lessons we can learn from unintended consequences covered in the latest chemical pollution research. As always, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, so pop these in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. I will ask these on your behalf at the end of the presentation. Thank you everyone for logging in, and I'll just hand over to Heather.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And I was really pleased to be invited to do this, especially because it was at the request of members of IES to talk about this issue. And I'm hoping that there'll be some of you on the call that know a lot more about it than me, and that I can get the chance to pick your brains as well. So this certainly isn't an overview of every issue, but I'll give you a few sort of lessons learned along the way and some of the things that I think we can do about the potential threats that chemicals can cause in a circular economy, because obviously there are some out there that are causing an issue, but we are reliant on chemicals. And as a chemist, I feel I always have to say that at the beginning of every presentation, that of course everything is made out of chemicals and we need to be able to manage them safely in any kind of economy, but it becomes particularly important in a circular economy. So just before I get started, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about FIDRA, because I know many of you won't have heard of our organisation before. We're an environmental charity, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we work on sustainability and pollution. I'll then talk a little bit more about the circular economy and give you 3 examples where we can help make the circular economy safer. So looking at bisphenols and PFAS chemicals, and then finally flame retardants. And then I'll draw out some of the key principles and policies that I think underpin addressing all of those groups, whether they're a persistent chemical like PFAS, a group of chemicals like PFAS, or another group of chemicals, bisphenols, which aren't persistent. So FIDRA, who we are? Well, as I said, we're an environmental charity. We're based in Scotland, but we work across the UK. And in fact, I work on some projects that are global as well. There's only about 10 of us. We're not all full-time. We're mostly scientists, and we tend to take this science and evidence-based approach to influencing positive environmental change. What that means is we often work collaboratively with industry and governments to do demonstrator projects that address environmental issues, and a lot of those environmental issues are to do with plastic pollution or with chemical pollution. So that's our main areas of focus at the moment. And we started about 10 years ago and have grown initially. This was before plastic pollution was the buzz sort of topic that it is today, and we're now sort of hoping that chemicals will be the next, and chemical pollution will be the next thing that we can turn policymakers' attention to. So that's a little bit about who we are. We're all over different social medias and got websites, so do look us up and feel free to get in touch. And if you want to tweet or connect with me on LinkedIn afterwards, please do. So why are we focusing on sustainability and pollution? Well, hopefully this image is fairly familiar to some of you already. This is the whole planetary boundaries concept. So it shows that once we pass that sort of dotted green line, we're outside the safe operating space for the planet. That safe operating space is where things are running, where we're using resources, but they're sort of replenishing as best they can, and it's safe for not just human life, but also ecosystems and the safe operating of the planet. Just last year, scientists figured out that we'd passed some of these limits already. So you can see climate change has been passed, and that we also have a loss of species. This is sort of this biosphere integrity segment. Some of the biogeochemical flows have been passed, which is to do with, some of that's to do with mining processes. Some of it's to do with loss of habitat, and land systems is also under threat. But the main one that we're looking at is this novel entities. So novel entities basically means the industrial pollutants that we've made over the last, mostly over the last 50 years. Some predate that 50 years, but it's things like plastic and chemicals. And you can see that far exceeds, it's been identified as the biggest sort of threat that we're facing at the moment, and we've already exceeded the planetary boundary. So that means that we're already at risk. We're already at risk. This is a problem that is here and now. And if you want to find out more about that, there's some great papers on it, and it's a good way of just putting this in context. Chemical pollution and plastic pollution are some of the biggest threats that we currently face. And part of the reason that why that risk exists is because we don't know enough about the chemical pollutants that are already out there and the effect that they're having. So there's untold, unknown consequences. At the moment, it's hard to quantify exactly what those are, but because of that unknown, we already think it's a massive risk, and that's been what the latest research is showing. So that's why we're focusing on that area. What that looks like and how those chemicals are getting out into the environment is changing. I think if you look at this sort of circle, the chemical and product manufacturing has largely been the focus of legislative action, particularly in the 20th century. And a lot has been done to improve industrial emissions and workplace safety. What has still to be addressed is product use and the chemicals that go out into the environment from that, things washing off products, contaminated sewage. So that's not just the stuff that you wash off and put down the drain. It's realizing that as humans, we are vectors for some of these chemical pollutants. We're absorbing them, we're inhaling them, and we're excreting some of that. And some of it is interfering with our metabolism along the way. There's also landfill leaching, and then recycling in the circular economy, and can also add different chemicals back into the environment. So there's all these different routes and different ways that chemicals are now reaching the environment, as well as directly from chemical and product manufacturing. So when we're talking about the circular economy, one of the things I think it's important to remember is that, we've traditionally had these linear models where you start off with the resource, you go down through design and production, use and consumption, then it becomes waste. Some of that might get recycled. In a circular economy, it's actually initially about keeping things in use for longer, reusing them, repairing them, remanufacturing them, and then only at the very end, when that can't be done anymore, does it become recycled. So the first stage in a circular economy is making sure that things can be used for as long as possible. However, we've kind of been retrofitting the circular economy to our linear economy, and a lot is going through this recycling route. One of the examples where this has been a problem is the use of bisphenols in thermal paper in receipts. So bisphenols, BPA is the one you might have heard of, is recognised as being toxic for reproduction. You see BPA-free water bottles, for example, or BPA-free on tin cans. And that's because it has been identified as interfering with hormones. And toxic to reproduction is one of the effects, as well as being potentially carcinogen. So this has meant that bisphenols have been found in people, in recycled products, and the environment. And then when they're used in receipts, for example, they can enter our bodies through our skin when touching receipts and tickets. And this has meant that the BPA has also been banned in receipts, because the risk to the unborn babies of cashiers was deemed to be too high due to the dermal uptake during pregnancy. And that was the bit that entered into law in the EU and in the UK as part of the EU at the time in 2020. However, it's been banned in BPA. The ban on BPA has given a rise to the use of BPS. And as you can see from these diagrams, bisphenol A is very similar to bisphenol S. They're in the same chemical group. They both still have the same similarities to estrogen. And in fact, BPA was first explored as a possible contraceptive. So you can see the similarities are continuing down the group. BPS has now been classified as an endocrine disruptor, or it will be from November 2023. It's already been agreed, and that's when it comes in. And in the UK, BPB and another bisphenol is being considered as a substance of very high concern. So you can see that you've got this continuing problem with the whole group of bisphenols. So what has that meant? That we've got bisphenols in the environment. It's in the air. It's on beaches and on waterways globally. And this is despite the fact that this chemical isn't actually persistent, but it's sometimes called pseudo-persistent because there is so much of it. Bisphenol A has been one of the bulk chemicals that is produced globally, and it's now got sort of into all different compartments, and it is pseudo-persistent because there is so much of it being produced all of the time that it's sort of continually being replenished. It is responsible for hormone disruption and reproductive stress in wildlife, as well as being a threat when it's in use to certain groups. And for a circular economy, what that has meant is that bisphenols have been found in things like recycled pizza boxes, and that's from the recycling from thermal paper. It's been found in toilet paper, again, because thermal paper has been recycled into recycled toilet paper. It's been found in sewage sludge, and this sewage sludge has been used as an agricultural fertilizer. So you can see how something from a product can get into us and get out into the sewage and then be applied to fields. And they've even managed to do some studies at Robert Gordon University and looking at the application onto fields and how that gets back into livestock. So you can see these recycled products are contaminated. So what can we do about this? Well, at FIDRA, we got in touch with a number of different retailers, and when this switch was happening in the law from BPA being banned, we were making sure that these retailers were aware of the risk of the rest of the group, and that when they had to make a change anyway, why not just move away from bisphenols altogether? And you can do that in a number of different ways. You don't have to have a receipt at all. You could have a digital receipt, or you can have bisphenol-free paper. And many of the UK retailers voluntarily started phasing out all bisphenols from their till receipts. So that's a good response, but it's not the end of the story. We're only a small organisation. We managed to get in touch with the major retailers, but if you can think about every single receipt that's handled, all the thermal paper that's used in restaurants, for example, people are still at risk and the environment is still at risk. So to future-proof against further changes, we think we need this kind of group-based approach. And we heard retailers saying that this is what they would prefer, is to have no bisphenols at all in receipts. They see it as protecting their employees and the environment from these substitutes. And it's a more cost-effective and efficient way of ensuring better protection. So if it was brought into legislation, it would mean that the retailers almost didn't have to pay attention to this and what their suppliers were up to. It would just be in place. But we're still waiting for what the UK government are calling a risk management options analysis, or preferably we'd like to see it just progress to restriction, where all of these bisphenols are banned in receipts. So watch this space on that one. We have been told that there's a risk management options analysis going to be published on this that could put forward a restriction, but we're still waiting. It was due by now. Another group of chemicals that we are seeing as a potential risk to the circular economy are PFAS, these per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, which have been getting a bit more press attention. And some of you might have seen the film Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo in it, that is based on a true story. It's a bit of an Aaron Brockovich style story of a corporate lawyer taking on DuPont because of their pollution of PFAS in a town in America. But this isn't just an American problem. It's a group of over 5,000 industrial chemicals, and they are extremely persistent because of that carbon-fluorine bond. And there's growing evidence that a number of this group of chemicals. A number of the chemicals in this group are toxic and accumulate and have high mobility. And they are cropping up all over the world in all compartments. Got air, soil, drinking water, and even our own bloodstreams. And it's associated with a range of negative health impacts. So where are these things being used? Well, they are being used on school uniforms in stain resistance. And that was our first project, was to, again, go back to retailers and say, can you take them out of these school uniforms? We don't think that they're doing anything. We did a consumer survey and found that actually in school uniforms, it doesn't mean that you wash them any less if they've got this stain resistance on them. It also doesn't mean that you have to replace your school uniforms any less frequently. So consumers weren't getting a benefit. And again, retailers tended to respond and did move away from this group of chemicals, but it didn't end there. Unfortunately, another common use of PFAS, because of this sort of stain resistance, is because it's oil and water resistant. So it's used on sort of paper packaging like this. So you kind of bakery bags. And you can see that that might be a fairly useful thing. You don't want to have bags that fall to pieces, but often it's just a cosmetic thing because people don't like grease spots on their packaging. And I think it's quite obvious to you all, if you've got this very persistent chemical and a bag that's going to be used for minutes at most, that's perhaps not a good use of that chemical. Because it persists, when that paper is recycled, or in fact compostable materials as well, so the compostables that are being used often to replace polystyrene, that moulded fibre is often coated with PFAS too. So you can see that there's two routes there for it to get back into the environment, and in a circular economy where you're recycling this paper or you're composting this paper packaging, then it can get back into the environment. So many of the supermarkets have said that they want to work towards phasing these out, and the British Retailer Consortium recently held a webinar on this. Packaging suppliers are trying to get ahead of the game and offering PFAS-free alternatives. And some supermarkets are committing to change. So again, we're seeing some of the major supermarkets saying that they don't want to use this group of chemicals in their food packaging. We have just had news, so this was under a previous DEFRA minister, that they were going to address this group of chemicals. And I have had news recently that we are expecting the results of a risk management options analysis potentially next week. So we may see the government setting out some options for managing this group of chemicals. And again, we would like to see a group-based restriction. There is support from international investors, with signatories representing over $1 trillion signing on to a letter to the retail and food industry saying that they don't want to invest in companies that use this group of chemicals, and 3M have committed to moving away from it. And there's a number of other movements going on. So Chemsec in Sweden have set up this No to PFAS movement and calling on businesses to declare that they want to move away from PFAS, and a number of businesses have done so. So that, again, companies are taking a bit of an attempt to sort this out. But again, we'd like to see this backed by legislation, and Denmark have already done that with food packaging, so it is possible. The final example I just wanted to touch on was about halogenated flame retardants and organophosphate esters used as flame retardants. Again, these are persistent chemicals and they've been causing concern. So they are, again, an environmental contaminant. Some of them are POPs already under the Stockholm Convention, so these persistent organic pollutants. A number of UK upholsterers have expressed their concerns about these chemicals as a health concern. They can be a blockage to recycling and the use of secondary materials. So if it has already got something that has now been found to be a POP under the Stockholm Convention, it means that you can't recycle it in the way that you would have been able to. And we've seen just this year, it's creating a massive waste burden. So these flame retardants that have been used historically in furniture, in sofas, for example, now local authorities aren't able to accept them because they don't know what to do with them, and they haven't set up the waste systems to deal with it, because they're contaminated with what are now banned chemicals that weren't banned chemicals when they were produced. We're also seeing that the use of these chemicals could be a risk, and pieces of legislation like the Green Claims Code and EPR schemes, so these extended producer responsibility schemes, because if you can't recycle something, it can make, because of the presence of these chemicals, it makes it that much harder. So what can we do about this? Well, one of the main issues has been that we don't know what chemicals are in furniture. There isn't a labelling requirement. You have to say that there are flame retardants there to meet what are now outdated fire safety regulations. But you don't have to say which flame retardants are there. So potentially this sort of sofa mountain that has been building up in the UK could have been averted, because not all of those sofas may contain flame retardants, but because that are problematic, but because we don't know, they will have to be destroyed through high temperature incineration. So labelling and transparency would be a good first step. The current regulations also need to be updated. So the UK uses an awful lot of these flame retardants in our furniture because of what are now outdated regulations from the 1980s. And fire safety has moved on a lot since then. The risks from smoking have reduced a lot, and other countries have been able to update their fire safety regulations without a rise in deaths due to fire. And in fact, we've found that flame retardants can increase smoke toxicity, which is one of the biggest risks from fire. So the flammability needs to be weighed up against the toxicity. So there is updates that can be made to this regulations, and we're hoping to see those regulations updated shortly. But exactly what that will look like, we don't know. And again, it just shows that we need to think about the whole life cycle of a product and the whole, the entirety of the impacts of that product when designing regulations and when thinking about how you use and reuse or repair, in this case, if it's for upholstery, and remanufacture products. So it's a good example where, you know, we think potentially if the regulations do change, there may still be some flame retardants used in some instances, but we really need to be able to track those through the system so that if they are later banned, that they can be removed from waste streams appropriately and treated appropriately. So watch this space on that one. So what do all of these sort of examples show us? Well, I think it means that we need to use the knowledge available to us and the available data, but we also need to take this precautionary approach to building a safe circular economy and really making sure that we're avoiding some of these problems happening again in the future. This can actually support innovation. A lot of time, the words like regulations scare governments, and I think it needs to be seen as a support to innovation, and that companies who've invested in changes can be supported by regulation that levels the playing field, but it also opens up new opportunities. When a group of chemicals gets banned, for example, it often means that other players in the market can innovate, come up with alternatives, or doing different designs that get around the using of that chemical. So it can create opportunities both in green chemistry, but also in product design. We also need to think about transparency and traceability of chemicals. There may be instances that we need to use harmful chemicals, that we need to use persistent chemicals, but if we can trace those and have transparency on that, that might make it easier to manage in the future. We also think that this group-based approach to managing chemicals will help simplify regulations and avoid regrettable substitutions. So we're not just going from BPA to BPS to BPB to BPF and spending a long time trying to regulate each of those chemicals individually and assess them all individually. Let's use our chemical knowledge to say that's a group. They're all likely to share some of the same similarities in terms of their toxicity profile. If a chemical in that group is found not to be problematic, great, it can get a derogation from that group legislation. But let's take that precautionary approach and look at chemicals as groups. So we would like to see policy and legislation change and extend the sort of health and environmental benefits that we've seen that from individual companies making applied across sectors. And there are some things coming up at the moment, like the UK chemical strategy. As I said, there's potentially a risk management options analysis on PFAS coming out very shortly, where you might be able to get involved. Some of these things aren't going to public consultation, but you can still write to your local MP and raise this issue or get in touch with ministers. And hopefully EIS has got some work going on as well at the policy level on this. IES. So I'm hoping that that gives you a bit of an overview of what we're doing and what some of the issues are in the circular economy, but also what we can do about them. And that I've left you with a feeling of that there is hope on this and that it can be improved over the next few years. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that have come through.
Hi, Heather. Thank you very much for that. It's really interesting to see why and where these chemicals are being used. And obviously, it's nice to hear that other countries are already implementing policy changes to update that. We do have a couple of questions, so I'll just get started. We have one from Susan, and it's, what is it specifically about the receipts that needed BPA? Was it the ink or the paper?
Yeah, it was a thermal developer, so it was in the paper, and then when heat was applied, so you might have even noticed it yourself, sometimes you get given a receipt and it's still a bit warm, so when heat was applied that would make the ink appear. It isn't absolutely necessary. There are alternatives, and you can still have thermal paper receipts without the use of bisphenols, but that's why they're kind of I guess they're more modern receipts. In the olden days, it was ink applied to paper, and those receipts that you can probably still just about picture what those looked like didn't necessarily have bisphenols in. Although, of course, we have found that lots of different recycled papers have bisphenols in because of their use on thermal paper.
Do you think with the supermarkets and other shops, it's the cost of changing from the bisphenol-free paper, or do you think it's just the knowledge of not knowing that it has these chemicals?
So I think the knowledge was the first issue. So when we flagged it to them, some companies were aware of it, but a lot of them wrote back and said, oh no, don't worry, we're already BPA free, we knew this was coming. And they hadn't realised that there was a whole group of other chemicals, and they hadn't realised the supplier had just switched. We did find that then the sort of second barrier, if you like, was cost. So it wasn't, when we talked to suppliers of paper, they said it wasn't necessarily going to cost more in the long run. It was just that it hadn't been a popular choice. So there was economies of scale at play there. But one of the big things that we did was say, well, can you offset the cost of, perhaps it was looking like it might be up to 30% more expensive, this bisphenol-free paper at the moment, but we think it was going to drop. But could you offset that by not printing receipts automatically? And that was just a software update.
Mm-hmm.
And so just asking people, do you want a receipt? And the default being it doesn't print, rather than, we've all been in a shop where they've said, do you want a receipt? And they still have to take the receipt out and then bin it.
Yeah.
And you just think that's such a waste of paper, and that poor cashier is now exposing themselves to bisphenols unnecessarily for every single transaction. So that was a big saving, as well as the digital receipts as well. So there was ways to offset the initial extra cost, which is coming down now.
Fantastic, thank you. This one's quite a long one. So in terms of waste management, in my view, the difficulty is how to classify waste containing these chemicals. Most of the waste would normally be considered non-hazardous, suitable for recycling, and the classification systems are not robust enough to capture such chemical concerns. Do you have any views on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think there are things, well, there are allegedly things going on which seem to have gone a bit quiet about having like a national waste database and things like this that I think could help with that. But I think we just need greater transparency on the chemicals in products, and retailers find it difficult to find out this information, let alone consumers or recyclers. But it has to be, we have to switch this round so that you can find out the information on chemicals and products a lot more easily. And I don't see why for bulky items like furniture that have got lots of labelling requirements anyway, you couldn't do that. Of course, it's going to be tricky for other things like your paper packaging and things like this. But generally, we're moving to, you think about the stuff that goes on food packaging now and the amount of labelling that has. So you can know an awful lot about the food, but not the packet.
Yeah.
So I think it is possible to do it, but that's going to be quite a long-term project to get that transparency in the data and be able to communicate that right down supply chains to the very end of the supply chain. So I don't think it's a quick and easy fix, but we have got some projects at the moment looking at mattresses and whether that, for example, there could be smart labelling or something like that to help us track it through the supply chain. But yeah, it's a massive challenge.
Fantastic. This question relates a little bit more to FIDRA. I've always been concerned about the lack of training and teaching on chemical awareness in everyday life. Does FIDRA run any awareness programs like this?
In short, we don't. But I've also got personal interest in that. I used to work on education initiatives for the Royal Society of Chemistry, so maybe we should. But yeah, I think we are seeing undergraduate degrees talking about green chemistry more, but some of this work means it's not just about educating chemists, it's about educating product designers, it's about purchasing, and to some extent it's about consumer awareness. But I don't like to lean on that. I think it's unrealistic to be able to expect consumers to be able to read the back of everything and make informed decisions about whether they want to take that risk of buying that product. And also it assumes a level of choice that we often don't have. So I think a lot of this is sort of professional awareness as well. But yeah, if people have got ideas on that, I'd love to hear them, because yeah, it is a sort of personal area of interest of mine, even if we're not doing it at FIDRA.
Yeah, and fantastic, thank you. And just to follow up on Peter's earlier, he just wanted to say thank you for answering that. It's really tricky owing to the small concentrations that can create a residual hazardous properties. So really it is looking to ban these chemicals. Yeah,
absolutely. I think in a lot of cases, the simplest thing to do is to bring in group restrictions for the most harmful chemicals. And yeah, that would certainly be our preference, of taking a more precautionary approach. And I think as well, a preventative approach of stopping these chemicals getting onto the market in the first place. So the registration of chemicals, the assessment of those chemicals, of whether they should be on the market in the first place. At the moment, we feel like we wait till a chemical goes onto the market and then have to retrospectively work out the harm it's done and then bring in a restriction. So it really needs to be going the other way around.
Fantastic. Sorry, there's one more question that's just come in. I've noticed that a lot of supermarkets have started soft plastic recycling points. Do you know how this plastic is recycled and why this is retailer-led?
I'm afraid I don't know how it's recycled. In terms of why it's retailer-led, I guess, yeah. Let's say that, again, I would only be guessing. I would assume it's because they want to be seen to be doing the right thing. Perhaps it also means they can get involved in EPR schemes as well, so they can show that it's they're bringing some of that material back in. But yeah, I'm afraid the soft plastics isn't something I know too much about.
Fantastic. I know that you had a couple of questions that you wanted to put to the attendees so that they could get in touch if they had any ideas. So do you want to
Yeah,
just let us know?
sure. So a bit of homework to leave you with, maybe. I wanted to hear your views if there was other groups of chemicals that you think we should be thinking about. I can't make any promises, but always open to hear what people's views are. The reasons why we started working on bisphenols was partly because we knew that there was this opportunity with the changing in legislation around receipts. One of the reasons why we started working on PFAS was it seemed like a big group of chemicals that was a massive threat that was being recognised in America and Australia initially, but in the UK hadn't really been covered as much. And again, we could see that there were moves in Denmark on the food packaging. So we thought, why can't we do the same thing here? So we often, and then we've got this work on flame retardants happening at the moment as well. So we often pick groups of chemicals that we think there's something that can be usefully done. But even if you don't have the answer to what can be done about it, even if you can make suggestions of groups of chemicals that you think are of concern that maybe you're noticing, then please do get in touch. We'd love to hear your ideas. That was one of my questions. My other question was, these are some of the things that we think need to be done that I've mentioned, of sort of policy interventions and going directly to retailers or talking to investors. Are there other solutions out there, you think, to the issue that we haven't considered? Are there other ways of approaching this that either your organisation could do or that you think FIDRA should do? Again, open to suggestions on that side of it. So yeah, those are some bits of food for thought, really.
Thank you. And if anyone does have any comments and feedback on that, I'm happy to share Heather's contact details. I know that we're on the slides as well. So thank you again, Heather. It's really interesting to see the work that FIDRA are doing, and hopefully you do get some feedback from that. So thank you for everyone logging in today. That's it from us today. I hope you found that beneficial and informative.